The ballroom doors burst open. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Glasses froze halfway to lips. A ripple moved across the room as heads turned toward the entrance of Whitmore Grand Hotel. Daniel Cole stepped inside. Not rushed, not dramatic, just steady. Amara's hand rested in his. Whispers spread. "Isn't that Daniel?" "The liar? What's he doing here?" Across the room, Ryan Whitmore smirked. "Of course he showed up," he muttered. "Man never misses a chance to pretend." Daniel heard it. He always heard it. He didn't react. A waiter approached. "Good evening, sir." Daniel gave a small nod. Not yet. He walked past the marble pillars, past the chandeliers, past the classmates who once laughed at him in smaller rooms. 10 years earlier, those same voices had echoed through a school hallway. "You? Billionaire's son?" "Bro, I stop lying. If your dad is rich, why are you wearing that same jacket again?" Back then, Daniel had clenched his fists. Now he simply breathed. The night of the reunion wasn't supposed to feel like this. It was supposed to be simple. Show up, smile, leave. But fate had a sense of timing. 10 years earlier, at 15, Daniel had stood in another doorway. This one smaller, paint-chipped, the smell of cooking oil thick in the air. His father, Harrison Cole, had stood tall beside him. "You'll stay here," Harrison had said. Daniel stared at the modest house. "For how long?" "As long as it takes." "For what?" "For you to understand who you are without my name." Daniel's jaw tightened. "So, I'm a project now?" Harrison's voice didn't rise. "You're my son." "That doesn't feel like it." Silence stretched. Then Harrison handed an envelope to Marcus Bennett, Daniel's uncle. "Take care of him. Don't treat him differently." Marcus nodded once. "He won't be special here." Daniel laughed bitterly. "Clearly." When the car disappeared down the street, Daniel stood there, abandoned in a world that didn't match the stories he'd grown up hearing. At school, the difference became obvious immediately. Ryan Whitmore arrived in a new car at 16. Elias Morgan walked in with worn sneakers but steady eyes. Daniel took the bus. "Yo, Cole," Ryan called one afternoon, leaning against his convertible. "You said your dad owns companies, right?" Daniel kept walking. Ryan followed. "Which one? Fantasy Incorporated?" Laughter exploded. Daniel stopped. "You don't have to believe me." "Oh, I don't," Ryan grinned. "I just enjoy the comedy." Daniel swallowed the anger. At home, Marcus handed him a broom. "Sweep the yard." Daniel frowned. "You know my father." Marcus cut him off. "I know you live here." That night, Daniel lay on a narrow bed staring at the ceiling. Who am I without his name? The next morning, he woke up before dawn. He started working at a small grocery store after school, bagging items, sweeping floors. One evening, as he counted coins for bus fare, a soft voice spoke behind him. "You don't look like someone who lies." He turned. Amara Bennett stood there holding 2 cups of coffee. "You been listening?" he asked. "Everyone has," she said gently. "You don't defend yourself much." "What's the point?" She handed him a cup. "Maybe you're waiting." "For what?" "For the right time." Daniel studied her. "Ah, you don't think I'm crazy?" She smiled. "If you were lying, you'd try harder." For the first time in months, Daniel felt seen. Their conversations grew, under streetlights, over textbooks, in silence. One afternoon, Ryan cornered Daniel near the lockers. "So when's Daddy wiring you a private jet?" Daniel stayed calm. "I don't need one," Ryan scoffed, "because it doesn't exist." Daniel leaned closer. "Keep talking." Ryan's smile faded for a second. Then he laughed it off. But the words stayed. Years passed. Daniel worked, studied, learned restraint. Elias started a small delivery business from his garage. Ryan partied harder. One evening, Daniel overheard news on the television. Whitmore Industries under investigation for financial misconduct. Ryan stormed into school the next day. "Mate, don't look at me like that," he snapped at a group whispering nearby. Daniel watched quietly. Arrogance looked different when fear entered the room. At 19, Daniel confronted Marcus. "Did my father abandon me?" Marcus didn't look up from fixing a cabinet. "No." "Then what is this?" Marcus finally turned. "Preparation." "For what?" "For a world that won't care who your father is." Daniel's voice cracked. "But I do." That night he called Harrison. The phone rang 4 times. "Hello." "Why?" Daniel asked immediately. "Because comfort makes weak men, and distance makes strangers." Silence. "You think I don't watch?" Harrison said quietly. "You think I don't know you work 2 jobs?" Daniel froze. "You think I don't know about the grocery store? The late nights? Then why not help me?" "Because you're helping yourself." Daniel's anger softened into confusion. At 24, Harrison fell ill. Daniel stood in a hospital room that smelled sterile and final. Harrison looked smaller. "I needed to know," Harrison whispered, "that if I disappeared tomorrow, you would stand." Daniel's throat tightened. "I would have stood with you." Harrison's eyes softened. "You are stronger than I ever was at your age." Daniel felt something shift, not wealth, understanding. When Harrison passed months later, Daniel didn't cry in public. He held Amara's hand. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Of what?" she asked. "Of becoming someone I don't recognize." She squeezed his fingers. "Then don't." On his 25th birthday, 2 lawyers arrived. "Hey, Daniel Cole?" "Yes. You are the sole beneficiary of the Harrison Cole Trust. Documents unfolded, shares, hotels, companies, accounts, billions." Daniel sat silently. Amara stared at him. "You knew?" she whispered. "I knew something," he replied. "Not this." He looked at the papers, then at Marcus. Marcus nodded once. "Now you understand." Daniel didn't celebrate. He visited the grocery store. He invested quietly in Elias's business. He paid off Marcus's mortgage. He never posted anything online. And now, 10 years after the laughter, he stood in Whitmore Grand Hotel, owned by Harrison Cole Holdings, owned by Daniel. Ryan approached with a glass in hand. "So you still telling that story?" Ryan smirked. Daniel met his eyes calmly. "I don't have to tell it anymore." Ryan laughed. "You booked this place?" Daniel tilted his head. "Yeah, something like that." The room buzzed louder. "If you've made it this far, stay with this story. Because what happens next changes everything." Ryan leaned closer. "You're still that kid with bus fare problems." Daniel smiled slightly. "Am I?" The tension thickened. Amara squeezed his hand gently. Ryan raised his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, Daniel here claims he owns this hotel." Laughter erupted again. Daniel exhaled slowly. He took out his phone and made one call. "Could you join me in the ballroom?" Across the room, the hotel manager stiffened. Heads turned. Footsteps approached. The manager stopped in front of Daniel. "Good evening, Mr. Cole. We weren't informed you'd be attending tonight." Silence fell like a curtain. Ryan's smile vanished. Daniel didn't smirk. He didn't boast. He simply said, I thought I'd stop by." The manager nodded respectfully. "The boardroom is prepared whenever you're ready, sir." And just like that, the air shifted. But Daniel wasn't finished. Not with them. Not with himself. And not with the girl who stood beside him when he had nothing. The real moment was still coming. Ryan's face drained of color. "You're joking," he said, forcing a laugh that no one joined. The hotel manager remained composed. "Would you like me to arrange a private table, Mr. Cole?" Daniel glanced around the ballroom. Faces he hadn't seen in years stared back at him. Some stunned, some embarrassed, some calculating. He shook his head gently. "No, it's fine. I'm just here for the reunion." The manager nodded respectfully. Of course, sir. Then he stepped away. A heavy silence lingered. Ryan cleared his throat. So, what? You bought it recently? Daniel met his eyes. It was never yours to begin with. A few classmates shifted uncomfortably. Someone whispered, "Is this real?" Amara stepped closer to Daniel, her voice calm but firm. It's real. Ryan's pride refused to collapse completely. So you were telling the truth all along? Daniel didn't answer immediately. He let the weight of that question settle. I was telling my truth, he said finally. The difference hit harder than any insult. 10 years earlier, Daniel had stood in the school cafeteria holding a tray that barely cost $5. Ryan had sat across from him, surrounded by noise. You know what your problem is? Ryan had said back then. Daniel had looked up. What? You don't know your place. Daniel had replied quietly. Maybe I just haven't arrived there yet. Laughter, mockery, and humiliation. Back in the present, Ryan looked smaller somehow. What else do you own? Someone asked nervously from behind. Daniel shrugged lightly. Enough. The word wasn't arrogant. It was settled. Elias stepped forward from the crowd. You always were patient, Elias said, a small smile on his face. Daniel's expression softened. You built yours from nothing. Elias nodded. So did you. Ryan scoffed, but it lacked power. So what now? You throw us out? Daniel shook his head. Why would I? Ryan didn't respond. Daniel turned to the group. You all remember senior year? A few nodded cautiously. The day I said my father owned companies? Someone muttered. Yeah. You asked me for proof. Ryan crossed his arms. And you didn't have any. Daniel looked at him. I didn't need it. The room stayed quiet. And if I had shown you documents back then, Daniel continued, would it have changed who I was? No one answered. It wouldn't have changed the bus rides, the night shifts, the doubt. Ryan snapped. So what was the point of lying? Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. I wasn't lying. Ryan stepped closer. You expect us to believe that your dad just hid billions from you? Daniel held his gaze. Yes. The simplicity unsettled Ryan more than anger would have. Amara spoke softly. You never listened. Ryan looked at her. And you did? She met his stare. I listened to how he carried himself. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Daniel remembered another night. Rain pouring. Amara standing under a flickering streetlight. He had been frustrated after another round of ridicule. I'm tired, he had said. Of what? She asked. Of proving something I can't show. She had stepped closer. Then stop proving it. What? Let time do it. He had stared at her. What if time doesn't? She smiled gently. Then at least you'll know who you are. Back in the ballroom, Ryan shook his head. You could have ended all of this any time. Daniel's voice dropped lower. No. Ryan frowned. Why not? Because it wasn't about you. The words landed clean. Daniel continued. It was about whether I could survive without my father's shadow. Ryan laughed nervously. That's dramatic. Maybe, Daniel replied. But necessary. A former classmate named Jenna stepped forward. Why didn't you tell us? Daniel looked at her kindly. I did. She looked down. Ryan exhaled sharply. So what? We're the villains now? Daniel shook his head again. No, and we were kids. Ryan's frustration broke through. You let us think you were pathetic. Daniel's eyes softened. I needed to know if I believed in myself without applause. That hit harder than anything else. Elias spoke quietly. Most people only believe in themselves when others do. Daniel nodded slightly. Exactly. Ryan paced a few steps. You think this makes you better? No, Daniel replied calmly. It makes me tested. The word lingered. Ryan stopped moving. My father's company collapsed. You know that? Daniel nodded once. You never said anything. There was nothing to say. Ryan's voice cracked slightly. Everyone treated me differently after that. Daniel's expression didn't change. I know how that feels. Ryan looked away. A long pause filled the room. Daniel stepped forward slightly, addressing everyone now. I didn't come here to embarrass anyone. Ryan muttered. Could have fooled me. Daniel ignored it. I came because this was part of my life. All of it. He looked around slowly. The jokes, the silence, the doubt. Then he glanced at Amara. And the loyalty. Amara felt the shift. Daniel, she whispered. He squeezed her hand. Ryan folded his arms. So what's the speech about? Daniel inhaled slowly. My father once told me something, he said. Ryan rolled his eyes but didn't interrupt. He said, money reveals who you already are. Daniel looked at Ryan directly. I didn't want to become someone ugly. The room stayed frozen. Ryan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Daniel continued. I could have shown you everything at 18. Why didn't you? Someone asked quietly. Because I wasn't ready. For what? To own it without it owning me. That line settled deep. Elias let out a slow breath. You really waited. Daniel nodded. Amara spoke softly beside him. He almost walked away once. Heads turned toward her. Ryan looked curious despite himself. Walked away from what? From all of it, she said. Daniel looked at her. Tell them, she whispered. He hesitated, then spoke. 2 months before I turned 25, I was ready to disappear. Murmurs. Ryan frowned. Disappear? I was tired, Daniel admitted. Tired of carrying something no one believed. Amara nodded gently. He said he didn't want wealth if it meant becoming bitter. Ryan blinked. Daniel continued. My father was in the hospital then. A hush fell. He told me he watched everything. Ryan scoffed softly. Not convenient. Daniel's eyes sharpened slightly. It wasn't convenient. It was painful. Silence. He said he needed to know I could stand alone. Ryan stared at him. And could you? Daniel looked around the ballroom. Yes. The certainty in his voice made several people look down. Ryan swallowed. Congratulations, he muttered. Daniel shook his head. It's not about congratulations. Ryan snapped. Then what is it about? Daniel's gaze moved back to Amara. It's about who stays. The tension shifted again. Amara's eyes widened slightly. Ryan looked confused. What does that mean? Daniel stepped away from the group slightly, still holding Amara's hand. He faced her fully now. The entire ballroom watched. Daniel, she whispered again. He smiled softly. You once told me to let time prove itself. She nodded slowly. He took a breath. If you're still here, after everything. The room felt smaller. Ryan muttered under his breath, What is he doing? Daniel reached into his pocket. The movement was small but electric. Amara's eyes filled. Daniel, you don't have to. He lowered himself onto one knee. Gasps rippled across the ballroom. Ryan froze completely. Daniel looked up at her. I had wealth waiting for me, he said quietly. But you chose me before it arrived. Her lips trembled. I don't want to own this hotel without you. I don't want to lead companies without you. I don't want any of it if you're not beside me. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Amara Bennett, he said softly. Will you marry me? Silence. Pure, suspended silence. Then, yes. The word broke the room open. Applause erupted, not polite applause, real applause. Ryan stood still, stunned. May Elias smiled deeply. Daniel stood and placed the ring on her finger. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at her. Because in that moment, the wealth didn't matter. Only the loyalty did. And for the first time in years, the laughter in the room wasn't at him. It was for him. And this time, he had truly arrived. The applause slowly faded, but the shift in the room remained. Daniel held Amara close, her forehead resting lightly against his chest. For a moment, the ballroom, the chandeliers, the whispers, none of it mattered. Ryan cleared his throat awkwardly. So, that's it? Fairy tale ending? Daniel looked over at him, calm as ever. No, that's just the beginning. The words weren't sharp. They were steady. A few classmates approached cautiously. Jenna spoke first. Daniel, I'm sorry. For back then. He nodded. We were young. She shook her head. No, we were cruel. He didn't correct her. Ryan stood still, wrestling with something deeper than pride. You know, Ryan finally said, voice lower now, my dad used to say I'd inherit everything. Daniel listened. And I believed him, Ryan continued. I thought that was my identity. Daniel tilted his head slightly. And when it disappeared? Ryan swallowed. So did I. That landed. Years earlier, Ryan had stood in the school hallway, loud and untouchable. Status is everything, he had told a group of classmates. If you don't have it, you're invisible. Daniel had been close enough to hear. Now, looking at Ryan, he realized something. Ryan hadn't been cruel because he was rich. He had been scared of not being. Elias stepped forward again. Funny thing about status, he said calmly. It's rented. Ryan let out a dry laugh. Guess I missed the eviction notice. Daniel studied him for a long second. You don't have to stay stuck there, Daniel said. Ryan frowned slightly. Where? In the version of yourself that needed an audience. Ryan didn't respond immediately. Amara squeezed Daniel's hand gently. You don't owe anyone this, she whispered. Daniel gave her a soft look. I know. Across the ballroom, whispers continued. Did he really own it this whole time? Was he testing us? Why didn't he just say something? Daniel stepped toward the center of the room. Can I say something? The murmurs quieted. He didn't grab a microphone. He didn't need one. I used to think respect meant proving people wrong, he began. Eyes stayed fixed on him. But I learned something. Ryan crossed his arms again, but less defensively this time. Daniel continued. Respect isn't forced. It's built quietly. He glanced at Elias. Some of us built it with businesses. He looked at Ryan. Some of us had to rebuild it after losing everything. He looked at Amara. Some of us gave it when no one else did. Silence followed. Daniel exhaled slowly. When I was 17, I almost punched Ryan. A few surprised laughs broke out. Ryan blinked. You did? Daniel nodded. Cafeteria. You called me delusional. Ryan rubbed the back of his neck. Yeah, sounds like me. Daniel's voice softened. I didn't punch you because I realized something. What? Ryan asked. If I reacted to every doubt, I'd never grow. That truth hung heavy. Flashback memories flooded Daniel's mind. Long nights at the grocery store. Marcus handing him small envelopes with weekly allowances. You track every dollar, Marcus had said firmly. You don't spend what you don't earn. Daniel had argued once. But my father, Marcus cut him off. Your father isn't here. That sentence had felt like a knife at 16. But at 25, it felt like armor. Back in the ballroom, Daniel continued. There were nights I questioned everything. Amara nodded softly beside him. I asked myself if I was foolish to believe in something unseen. Ryan looked genuinely curious now. Why didn't you just demand access? Daniel smiled faintly. Because then I'd never know if I could survive without it. Elias let out a small breath. That takes restraint. Daniel shrugged lightly. It takes fear. Fear? Ryan repeated. Yes, Daniel said plainly. Fear of becoming weak. The word unsettled the room. Ryan stepped closer. You think I'm weak? Daniel met his eyes directly. I think we all are if we only know comfort. Ryan looked away first. A slow clap started from the back of the room. It wasn't mocking. It was thoughtful. Daniel shook his head lightly. This isn't a speech about winning, someone asked quietly. Then what is it? It's about time. He paused. Time humbles, time reveals, time corrects. Amara leaned closer. And time rewards, she whispered. Daniel smiled at her. Ryan looked at the ring on Amara's finger. You really would have married him if he stayed broke? Ryan asked bluntly. Amara didn't hesitate. Yes? Ryan searched her face. Why? She answered calmly. Because I never dated his future wealth. I dated his present character. A few people nodded slowly, and Daniel felt his chest tighten slightly. Years earlier, he had sat on a curb outside the grocery store after a long shift. I don't know if I can keep pretending, he had told Amara. You're not pretending, she had replied. It feels like it. She had knelt in front of him that night. If your truth needs proof to exist, she said softly, then it isn't truth. Back in the present, Daniel turned back to the room. I don't want apologies, he said. Ryan blinked. You don't? Daniel shook his head. No. Why not? Jenna asked. Because growth matters more. Ryan scoffed slightly. You make it sound easy. Daniel looked at him carefully. It wasn't. He stepped closer to Ryan. You know what hurt the most? Ryan hesitated. What? That I started believing you. Ryan froze. Daniel continued, voice steady but honest. For a moment, I thought maybe I was just a boy with stories. The room grew quiet again. But every time I worked, every time I endured, every time I chose not to react, I remembered something. What? Ryan asked quietly. That identity isn't given by others. Ryan's shoulders lowered slightly. Elias added, It's proven to yourself. Daniel nodded once. A server approached cautiously. Mr. Cole, the board members have arrived. Daniel glanced toward the entrance. Black suits, serious faces, power waiting. He looked back at his classmates. I could walk into that meeting right now, he said. Ryan nodded slowly. Yeah. But this moment matters more. The statement surprised everyone. Daniel turned to Amara. Are you ready? He asked softly. For what? She smiled. For everything. She nodded. Ryan cleared his throat. You're really different. Daniel gave a small smile. No. Ryan frowned slightly. I just waited. The room seemed to exhale. Ryan stepped forward slowly. I was wrong, he said quietly. Daniel held his gaze. Ryan continued. Not just about the money. About you. Daniel considered the words. You were loud, Daniel replied calmly. Ryan almost smiled. Still am. But you're learning, Daniel added. Ryan nodded once. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was real. And sometimes that mattered more. Daniel turned slightly toward the crowd. If you've ever been doubted, he said clearly, don't rush to silence the noise. He paused. Let it shape you. A few classmates nodded thoughtfully. Elias clapped Daniel on the shoulder. You built something stronger than wealth. Daniel looked at him. Oh, so did you. Ryan glanced at the board members again. They're waiting. Daniel followed his gaze. Yes, he said softly. But instead of walking toward them immediately, Daniel turned back to Amara one more time. You stayed, he whispered. She smiled gently. You stood. And for Daniel Cole, that was the real inheritance. Daniel finally turned toward the board members waiting near the entrance. The room parted slightly as he walked, not because of fear, but because of recognition. Recognition of growth. Recognition of change. Recognition of the boy who once rode the bus and now owned the building. Amara walked beside him, steady as ever. Ryan watched silently. Elias folded his arms with quiet respect. When Daniel reached the board members, one of them extended his hand. Mr. Cole, the quarterly projections are ready for review. Daniel shook his hand. Thank you. We'll begin shortly. The man nodded and stepped aside. Daniel turned back toward his classmates one last time before entering the private hall. 10 minutes, he said calmly. Then I'm coming back. Ryan raised an eyebrow. Coming back? Daniel smiled faintly. This is still my reunion. He and Amara disappeared through the side doors. The moment they were alone in the corridor, Amara stopped walking. She looked at him. You're shaking, she whispered. Daniel let out a breath he'd been holding. A little. She smiled softly. You handled that better than I would have. He shook his head. I almost lost control. When? When Ryan said I should have proved it sooner. Amara studied him. Why? Because for years, I wanted to. He leaned against the wall briefly. There were nights I almost called a lawyer at 18, he admitted. I almost demanded access. Amara listened quietly. But then I'd hear my father's voice. She tilted her head. What would he say? Daniel's voice softened. If you can't survive without it, you don't deserve it. Amara nodded slowly. And now? Daniel straightened. Now I don't need it to define me. She smiled. That's why you deserve it. They entered the boardroom. The executives stood immediately. Daniel took his seat at the head of the table. For a brief second, he remembered sitting at the small wooden table in Marcus's kitchen. Marcus had once pushed a notebook toward him. Write your expenses, Marcus had instructed. I don't have many, Daniel had said at 16. That's not the point, Marcus replied. The discipline isn't about amount, it's about habit. Now at 25, Daniel looked at spreadsheets worth billions, but his tone remained calm. Before we begin, he said to the board, there are changes I'd like to implement. The executives exchanged cautious glances. First, Daniel continued, we'll establish a mentorship program for underfunded students. One executive blinked. Sir? I lived in that space, Daniel said simply. Access shouldn't depend on last names. Another board member leaned forward. That will impact short-term profit margins. Daniel nodded once. Then we'll adjust elsewhere. There was firmness in his voice now, not arrogance, authority. He continued, second, I want transparency across all subsidiaries. No shortcuts. A few stiffened. Daniel held their gaze. My father built this empire with discipline. We'll maintain it with integrity. Silence. Then one of the older executives nodded slowly. Understood, Mr. Cole. The meeting moved efficiently. Decisions made, strategies outlined. When Daniel finally stood to leave, one executive said quietly, Your father would be proud. Daniel paused. I hope so, he replied. He stepped back into the ballroom. Conversations resumed quickly when people noticed him return. Ryan approached cautiously this time. So? Ryan asked. So it begins, Daniel answered calmly. Ryan shook his head slightly. You're different from what I expected. Daniel smiled faintly. You expected someone louder. Yeah, Ryan admitted. Maybe someone who'd rub it in. Daniel looked around the ballroom. If I rub it in, he said quietly, then I become what I endured. Ryan nodded slowly. Can I ask you something? Ryan said. Daniel tilted his head. Did you ever hate us? Daniel didn't answer immediately. I was angry, he admitted. Ryan looked down. But hate? Daniel shook his head. No. Why not? Because hate keeps you tied to the past. Ryan absorbed that. Across the room, Elias joined them. I heard about the mentorship idea, Elias said quietly. Daniel nodded. You started small. You built from scratch. Imagine if you had resources earlier. Elias smiled. You're thinking long term. Daniel replied simply, My father taught me patience. Ryan sighed. Mine taught me expectation. The contrast was clear. Amara stepped closer again. You two going to rewrite history? She teased gently. Ryan gave a small, embarrassed laugh. Maybe. Daniel looked at Ryan carefully. What are you doing now? He asked. Ryan hesitated. Consulting, small firms, nothing glamorous. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. You're rebuilding. Ryan shrugged slightly. Trying. Daniel extended his hand. Ryan looked at it, surprised. What's this? Opportunity, Daniel said. Ryan blinked. You'd work with me? Not because we were friends, Daniel replied calmly, but because you understand loss. Ryan stared at him for a moment. You're serious? Yes. Ryan shook his hand slowly. I don't know what to say. Daniel smiled lightly. Say you'll do better. Ryan nodded once. I will. Elias watched the exchange carefully. Look at us, Elias muttered. 10 years ago, we were arguing over cafeteria seats. Daniel chuckled softly. Now we're discussing boardrooms? Amara smiled. Growth looks good on you. Ryan glanced at Daniel. You really never needed to prove it. I did you? Daniel looked around the room one more time. No, he said. I needed to survive it. A group of classmates approached cautiously again. One of them spoke. Daniel, can I ask something personal? He nodded. When you found out about the inheritance, what did you feel first? Daniel paused. Relief, he admitted. Relief, the classmate repeated. Yes, Daniel said. Not because of the money. Then why? Because it meant my father believed in me enough to wait. That shifted something in the room again. Ryan spoke quietly. I thought inheritance was automatic. Daniel shook his head. It's not about inheritance. It's about readiness. Amara squeezed his hand gently. You're not that boy anymore, she whispered. Daniel looked at her softly. No, he agreed. I'm not. But inside, he remembered that boy clearly. The bus rides. As the humiliation. The silent tears he never let anyone see. He remembered standing in front of a mirror at 18, asking himself, who are you without his name? Now he had the answer. He was disciplined. He was patient. He was tested. And he was loved. Ryan cleared his throat again. So what happens now? Daniel looked at him calmly. Now we build. Build what? Ryan asked. Daniel glanced at Amara. A future that isn't fragile. The music in the ballroom shifted to something softer. A few couples began to dance. Elias nudged Daniel lightly. Go. Daniel smiled faintly. He turned to Amara. Dance with me? She laughed softly. You don't even dance. I'm learning, he replied. They stepped onto the floor. Ryan watched quietly. Elias folded his arms with a satisfied look. As Daniel moved slowly with Amara, he leaned close to her ear. I almost didn't come tonight. She pulled back slightly. Why? Because I didn't want revenge. And now? He smiled gently. I don't need it. She rested her head lightly against him. You waited. He nodded. And you stayed. The lights reflected off the polished floor. And for the first time, Daniel didn't feel like he was proving anything. He was simply living it. The music slowed into something almost nostalgic. Daniel moved carefully, not perfectly, but honestly. Amara looked up at him with a soft smile. "You're still overthinking." "I always do," he admitted. "You don't have to control everything." He exhaled quietly. "I know." Across the room, Ryan stood alone for a moment before walking toward the balcony doors. Elias followed him. "You okay?" Elias asked. Ryan leaned against the railing. I don't know." "That's honest," Elias replied. Ryan stared out at the city lights. "I used to think I had everything figured out." Elias folded his arms. "We all did." Ryan let out a dry laugh. "I thought confidence meant being loud." "And now?" Ryan glanced back at Daniel dancing. "Now it looks like being calm." Inside, Daniel felt the shift too. The laughter wasn't sharp anymore. The air wasn't tense. He turned slightly as the music faded. Applause followed the final note. Ryan walked back in, slower this time. "Daniel," he called. Daniel looked over. Ryan hesitated. "Can we talk?" Daniel nodded. "Of course." They stepped aside near one of the tall windows. Ryan rubbed the back of his neck. "There's something I never told you." Daniel waited. "Senior year? When I called you delusional?" Daniel nodded once. Ryan swallowed. I had just found out my dad was under investigation." Daniel didn't react. "I was scared," Ryan admitted. "If you were telling the truth, then everything I believed about status, it wasn't solid." Daniel looked at him carefully. "So you attacked me?" Ryan nodded slowly. "Yeah." Daniel's voice stayed calm. "You didn't attack me. You defended your fear." Ryan let out a breath. "That doesn't make it better." "No," Daniel agreed. "But it makes it human." Ryan's eyes glistened slightly, though he blinked it away quickly. "I lost friends when the company collapsed." Daniel tilted his head. "Were they friends?" Ryan paused. "Guess not." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't hostile anymore. Ryan looked at Daniel. "Why offer me an opportunity?" Daniel answered honestly. "Because I know what it feels like to rebuild identity." Ryan nodded once. "I won't waste it." "I know," Daniel replied. Across the room, Amara watched them. Elias stepped beside her. "He's not angry." "No," she said softly. "He let it go years ago." Elias smiled. "That's strength." Amara glanced at him. "You built something too." Elias shrugged lightly. "I built slowly." She nodded. "Slow lasts." Daniel returned to her side a moment later. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yes," he said simply. Ryan approached again, this time with less tension in his posture. "So what's next for Mr. Cole?" he asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "Daniel is fine." Ryan smirked lightly. "All right, Daniel." Daniel looked around the ballroom. "Tomorrow, meetings, strategy, expansion." Ryan laughed softly. "That sounds exhausting." Daniel shrugged. "So did bagging groceries at 17. Ryan blinked. "You really remember all of that?" "Every shift," Daniel replied. He remembered Marcus handing him a worn envelope once. "You worked for this," Marcus had said. Daniel had opened it. It wasn't much, but it felt earned. Back in the present, Daniel glanced toward the entrance. Marcus stood there quietly, having arrived late. Daniel's expression softened instantly. He walked over. Marcus looked around the grand space. "Big place." Daniel smiled. "Yeah?" Marcus looked at him carefully. "You didn't let it change you." Daniel's voice dropped slightly. "You helped with that?" Marcus shook his head. "I just gave you chores." "You gave me discipline," Daniel corrected. Marcus nodded slowly. "Your father would have been proud tonight." Daniel looked down briefly. "I hope so." Marcus placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "He didn't test you to break you." "I know." Daniel said quietly. He tested me to strengthen me. Marcus smiled faintly. Then the test worked. Daniel looked back at the room, Ryan speaking to Elias, Amara laughing with Jenna. The tension that once filled those spaces was gone. He stepped toward the center again. Before the night ends, Daniel said, voice carrying calmly across the room, I want to say one more thing. The chatter faded. When I was younger, I thought success would silence doubt. He paused. It doesn't. People leaned in slightly. It just reveals who listened. His eyes moved briefly to Amara. To anyone here who feels underestimated, don't rush the proof, he continued steady. Let your character grow stronger than the noise. Ryan nodded slowly from where he stood. Elias folded his arms with quiet approval. Daniel's tone softened further. And when the moment comes, don't use it to humiliate. Silence deepened. Use it to build. A few people clapped quietly. Daniel stepped back. The night slowly relaxed again into laughter and conversation, but it was different now. Less sharp, more reflective. Amara touched his arm. You didn't have to say all that. I needed to, he replied. Why? Because I remember being 17 and feeling small. She smiled gently. You're not small. He looked at her softly. I never was. The truth of that settled between them. Ryan approached one last time. I'll call you Monday, Ryan said. Daniel nodded. I'll be ready. Ryan hesitated. And Daniel? Yes? Thank you. Daniel held his gaze. Do better. Ryan smiled slightly. I will. As the night wound down, guests began to leave. Elias shook Daniel's hand firmly. Proud of you, Daniel smiled. Proud of you too. Let's build something meaningful, Elias added. Daniel nodded once. We will. Marcus hugged Amara warmly. You chose well, Marcus told her quietly. She smiled. So did he. Finally, the ballroom grew quieter. The staff began clearing tables. Daniel stood alone for a moment in the center of the room. He looked around slowly. 10 years ago, he had stood alone in a school hallway feeling invisible. Tonight, he stood visible. But more importantly, he stood steady. Amara walked back to him. Ready to go home? She asked softly. He smiled. Yeah. As they walked toward the exit, Daniel paused once more. He looked back at the grand chandelier above. Not with pride, not with revenge, but with gratitude. He turned off the lights himself. Outside, the city air felt cool and honest. Amara slipped her hand into his again. You waited, she said. He nodded. And you stayed. They walked toward the car quietly. The engine started. The hotel lights dimmed behind them. Daniel didn't feel like the boy who needed to prove anything anymore. He felt like a man who had survived it. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been doubted, underestimated, or laughed at, remember this. Time humbles, character lasts, and loyalty wins. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments. What would you have done in Daniel's place? Because sometimes, the greatest flex isn't wealth. It's who you become without it. The car ride home was quiet, but not heavy. City lights blurred past the windows. Amara leaned her head gently against the seat and watched Daniel from the corner of her eye. You're thinking again, she said softly. Daniel gave a small smile. I always am. About tonight? He nodded once. About everything. She studied him. Regret? He shook his head. No, just perspective. Silence settled for a moment. When I was 16, Daniel began, eyes still on the road, I thought turning 25 would feel like fireworks. And, she asked, it feels like responsibility. Amara smiled. That's growth. He exhaled slowly. There was a time I imagined walking into that reunion angry. I know, she said gently. He glanced at her. I wanted them to feel small, And now, I realize something, he said quietly. Yeah, making someone small doesn't make you bigger. She reached over and squeezed his hand. You're not that boy anymore. Daniel nodded. No, but I remember him. The car stopped at a red light. Daniel's mind drifted back. 16. Rain pouring. He had come home soaked after missing the bus. Marcus stood in the kitchen. You're late, Marcus said without looking up. The bus broke down. Marcus handed him a towel. Excuses don't build men. Daniel had snapped that night. I'm not supposed to be here. Marcus turned slowly. Where are you supposed to be? In a better house, with better things. Marcus stepped closer. Better things don't make better character. Daniel had stormed to his room. He remembered punching his pillow, frustration burning in his chest. He had whispered to himself in the dark, "This isn't fair." Back in the present, and the light turned green. Daniel drove forward. Do you ever resent him? Amara asked softly. My father? She nodded. Daniel thought carefully. I resented the distance, he admitted, not the lesson. Amara watched him closely. You forgave him? Yes. When? Daniel's voice lowered slightly. In the hospital. He remembered standing beside Harrison's bed, machines humming quietly, Harrison's voice barely above a whisper. I built everything from nothing, Harrison had said, but I almost lost myself chasing it. Daniel had stood frozen. I didn't want that for you, Harrison continued. So I gave you the one thing I never had. Daniel had frowned slightly. What? Hardship before power. Back in the present, Daniel swallowed lightly. I understood him that day, he said. Amara smiled softly. He prepared you. Daniel nodded. And they pulled into the driveway of the modest house Daniel had chosen to keep living in, even after inheriting everything. Amara looked at him. You could move anywhere. I know. Why stay? Daniel glanced at the small porch light glowing warmly. Because this place built me. They stepped out of the car. The air was cool and still. Inside, the house felt familiar, not grand, not flashy. Home. Daniel set his keys down and leaned against the counter. It's strange, he said quietly. What is? I don't feel rich, Amara smiled. That's because wealth isn't the loudest thing about you. He looked at her carefully. What is? Your restraint. He laughed softly. Restraint isn't glamorous. No, she said. It's powerful. He moved closer to her. Are you scared? He asked. Of what? This new life. Amara thought for a moment. No, she said honestly, because you're the same. Daniel studied her face. I was afraid, he admitted, that money would change how you see me. She shook her head gently. Money doesn't reveal who you are to me. What does? How you treat people when you don't have to. That sentence lingered. Daniel remembered the grocery store manager once asking him to stay late without extra pay. You don't have to, the manager had said. Daniel had stayed anyway, not for recognition, for discipline. Now he thought about the mentorship program he proposed in the boardroom. He wasn't trying to save the world. He was trying to honor the boy who needed help, but didn't ask for it. His phone buzzed on the counter, a message from Ryan. Thank you again. I won't waste this. Daniel stared at it for a moment. Amara leaned closer. You believe him? Yes, Daniel replied simply. Why? Because I've seen what loss does. Another message appeared, from Elias. Let's meet tomorrow. I have ideas. Daniel smiled faintly. Momentum, not chaos, not revenge. Momentum. He set the phone down. I don't want to become unreachable, he said suddenly. Amara tilted her head. What do you mean? I don't want people to feel like I'm above them. She stepped closer. Then don't rise in ego, rise in impact. He smiled. You make it sound simple. It is. she said softly. Stay grounded. Daniel walked toward the window. The neighborhood was quiet, ordinary. He liked that. At 17, he had once told Amara under that same window, "If I ever get everything, I don't want to forget this feeling." What feeling? She had asked. Being underestimated. Back in the present, he whispered to himself, "I won't forget." Amara wrapped her arms around him from behind. "What are you promising yourself?" she asked gently. "That I won't let comfort dull me." She nodded against his back. "You won't." He turned around to face her. "You stayed when I had nothing." She smiled softly. "You stood when you had nothing." He leaned his forehead against hers. "We're building something real," he said quietly. "Yes," she whispered. Outside, the city carried on as usual. Somewhere, someone else was being doubted. Somewhere, someone else was being tested. Daniel knew that now. He wasn't unique in struggle. He was just patient in it. He took a slow breath. "This isn't the end," he said softly. "No," Amara replied. "It's the foundation." He looked at her hand again, at the ring reflecting the soft kitchen light. Ready for what's next?" he asked. She smiled. "Always." And as the night settled around them, Daniel didn't feel like a billionaire. He felt like a man who had earned his own name. The next morning came without ceremony. No fireworks, no headlines, just sunlight through the kitchen window and the quiet hum of responsibility waiting. Daniel woke before his alarm. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, elbows on his knees, breathing slowly. This is real now. Amara stirred behind him. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep." "Nervous?" He considered the question. "Not nervous, focused." She smiled sleepily. "That's your version of nervous." He laughed softly. "Maybe." He stood, dressed simply. No flashy watch, no loud statement pieces. Just a tailored suit that fit without screaming for attention. As he adjusted his cuffs, Amara watched him. "You still look like the boy from the bus stop," she said. He glanced at her. "Good." "Why good?" "Because that boy learned how to wait." He grabbed his phone and saw a message from Marcus. "Proud of you. Don't rush decisions." Daniel smiled faintly. Another from Ryan. "I've drafted some restructuring ideas. Sending soon." And one from Elias. "Coffee, 9 a.m. No boardroom, just honesty." Daniel replied to Elias, "I'll be there." He turned to Amara. "Come with me." "To the meeting?" "To the coffee." She nodded. At 9 a.m. sharp, Daniel walked into a small cafe downtown. The same cafe where he used to sit after long shifts, counting coins before ordering the cheapest thing on the menu. Elias was already there, laptop closed, 2 cups waiting. "You're on time," Elias said. Daniel smiled. Knee still disciplined. Amara sat beside Daniel. Elias looked at him carefully. "You could have called a private meeting room." "I prefer this," Daniel replied. Elias nodded approvingly. "Good, because what we're building shouldn't start in marble." Daniel leaned back slightly. "Talk to me." Elias opened his notebook. "You want mentorship programs, education access, transparent subsidiaries?" "Yes." "That's noble," Elias said calmly. "But noble without structure collapses." Daniel smiled faintly. "I was hoping you'd say that." Elias continued. "We build it as a separate entity, sustainable, not charity, opportunity." Daniel nodded slowly. "Explain." "We create a foundation tied to performance metrics. Students earn support through discipline programs, internships in your companies." Daniel's eyes sharpened slightly. You want them tested?" Elias shrugged lightly. "You were." Daniel leaned forward. "I don't want them to suffer," he said. "Neither did your father," Elias replied evenly. Silence. Amara watched both men carefully. Elias continued, "Struggle isn't punishment. It's preparation." Daniel absorbed that. "You're right," he said finally. Elias closed the notebook. "I'll build the structure. But one thing." Daniel waited. "Don't let this become about redemption." Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You don't need to prove you're generous." Daniel exhaled slowly. "It's not about that." "Then what is it about?" Elias asked. Daniel looked out the cafe window. "When I was 17, I watched a kid drop out because he couldn't afford textbooks." Elias nodded slowly. "I didn't help." Daniel continued quietly. You couldn't." "I could have tried." Elias studied him. "You carry that." "Yes." Elias leaned forward slightly. "Then build something that outlives guilt." That sentence hit deep. Daniel nodded once. "All right," he said. "We build it properly." Amara smiled softly. Elias stood. "Then we start today." After Elias left, Daniel and Amara stayed seated. "You're quiet," she said gently. Daniel looked at his coffee. "I don't want to repeat my father's distance." "You won't." "How do you know?" "Because you talk about your fears." He looked at her. "My father didn't." She reached across the table. "Power doesn't isolate people. Silence does." He let that sink in. Later that afternoon, Daniel entered the main headquarters for the first time as acting CEO. The lobby was massive, polished floors, glass walls, executives moving with purpose. And the receptionist stood immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Cole." Daniel nodded politely. "Good morning." As he stepped into the elevator, he caught his reflection in the mirrored wall. For a split second, he saw the boy from years ago. Bus pass in hand, shoulders tense, eyes unsure. The elevator doors opened. The boardroom awaited. He stepped in. "Gentlemen," he began calmly, "we're restructuring community outreach." An executive spoke up quickly. "Sir, with respect, profits are strong. Why shift focus?" Daniel walked slowly around the table. "Because profit without purpose is fragile." Another executive frowned slightly. "Our shareholders—" "Will adapt," Daniel interrupted gently. He stopped at the head of the table. "We will not chase growth at the expense of integrity." Silence. One of the older board members cleared his throat. Your father said something similar once." Daniel nodded slightly. "Then we continue that legacy." A younger executive spoke carefully. "Sir, there will be resistance." Daniel's voice remained steady. "There was resistance when I said my father was wealthy." A few confused looks. Daniel continued. "Truth doesn't need volume. It needs time." The room quieted again. He outlined the mentorship framework Elias suggested. Structured access, performance-based support, internship pathways, long-term accountability. When he finished, there were no loud objections, just thoughtful silence. Finally, the older board member nodded. "We proceed." Daniel gave a single nod back. As the meeting ended, one executive approached privately. "Mr. Cole, may I ask something personal?" Daniel paused. "Of course. Why didn't you enter the company earlier? You had access at 25. You could have taken leadership immediately." Daniel met his gaze. "Because leadership without experience is dangerous." The executive nodded slowly. "You're not rushing." "No," Daniel said. "I waited 10 years. I can wait longer." That afternoon, Daniel visited Marcus. Marcus was in the yard, trimming hedges. "You don't have to do that," Daniel called out. Marcus glanced up. "I like doing it." Daniel stepped closer. "I've been thinking," Daniel said. "That's dangerous," Marcus muttered. Daniel smiled faintly. "I want you on the foundation board." Marcus blinked. "Me?" "Yes." Marcus shook his head. "I'm not corporate." "Exactly," Daniel replied. Marcus studied him carefully. "You're serious?" "Yes." Marcus nodded once. Then I'll ask you something. What? Don't lose your spine trying to be kind. Daniel absorbed that. I won't. That evening, Daniel sat alone on the porch for a moment. The sky was turning orange. He remembered being 16, sitting on those same steps, feeling invisible. Now he felt something else. Not powerful, prepared. Amara stepped outside and sat beside him. How was it? She asked. Productive. Challenging? Yes. She leaned against him lightly. You're carrying a lot. He nodded slowly. But it doesn't feel heavy, he said. Why not? Because I'm not carrying it alone. She smiled softly. He looked out at the quiet street. 10 years ago, I wanted revenge. And now? She asked gently. Now I want impact. She rested her head on his shoulder. That's maturity. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Somewhere inside him, and the boy who once felt small finally felt steady. And steady was stronger than loud. A week later, the headlines began. Not about Daniel inheriting billions, not about the reunion, but about the foundation. Cole Initiative launches Youth Leadership Program. Daniel stared at the article on his phone for a moment before setting it down. Amara walked into the office holding a folder. It's everywhere. He nodded slowly. Good. You don't look excited. I'm cautious. She smiled faintly. About what? Attention. She closed the door behind her. You can't build impact in silence forever. Daniel leaned back in his chair. I know. There was a knock. Ryan stepped in. You're officially trending, Ryan said, half amused. Daniel gave him a look. That's not the goal. Ryan shrugged. Still happening. Elias followed behind him. Our applications already crossed 1,000. Daniel sat up straighter. That fast? Elias nodded. People were waiting for something like this. Daniel felt the weight shift slightly. Not pressure, expectation. Ryan dropped a file on the table. I ran numbers. If we scale this properly, it can sustain itself within 3 years. Daniel looked at him carefully. And if it doesn't? Ryan met his eyes. Then we adjust. Not abandon. Daniel nodded once. Growth, not ego. They sat together reviewing structures, scholarship tiers, mentorship placements, business internships. Daniel's phone buzzed again. Unknown number. He answered. Daniel Cole. A hesitant voice replied. Hi, my name is Trevor. I applied this morning. Daniel paused. Yes? I just wanted to say, I didn't think someone like you would read applications personally. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Why not? Because you're rich. Ryan and Elias glanced at each other quietly. Daniel's voice stayed calm. Wealth doesn't remove responsibility. Trevor hesitated. I work nights. I almost didn't apply. Daniel swallowed lightly. I used to work nights too, he said. Silence on the other end. You did? Yes. Trevor's voice softened. Then maybe I have a chance. You do, Daniel replied, but you'll have to earn it. I will, Trevor said quickly. When the call ended, the room was quiet. Ryan leaned back slowly. You're going to get a lot of those. Daniel nodded. I hope so. That evening, Daniel visited the old grocery store. The same fluorescent lights, the same narrow aisles, and the manager recognized him instantly. Daniel? Daniel smiled. Good to see you. The manager looked him up and down. I saw the news. Daniel shrugged lightly. I'm still the same. The manager chuckled. You used to stay late without being asked. Daniel nodded. I remember. The manager's tone softened. Most people don't. Daniel walked down the aisle where he used to stock shelves. He could almost see himself there, head down, quiet, enduring. Outside, a young employee struggled with a heavy delivery box. Daniel stepped forward without thinking and helped lift it. The employee blinked. Thanks, man. Daniel smiled faintly. No problem. As he walked back toward his car, he noticed something. He didn't feel above this place. He felt connected to it. His phone buzzed again. Ryan. You just helped move a delivery box. Didn't you? Daniel frowned slightly. How did you? Manager posted a photo. You're viral again. Daniel sighed quietly. Amara's voice came through the speaker. Let it be what it is. Daniel leaned against the car for a moment. I don't want to become a symbol, he said. Ryan responded, You already are. Of what? Patience, Ryan said honestly. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Later that night, the board called an emergency meeting. Daniel entered the room to tense expressions. What happened? He asked calmly. One executive spoke first. A competitor is attacking the foundation publicly. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. On what grounds? They claim it's performative, a branding strategy. Ryan crossed his arms. Predictable. Elias leaned forward. This was coming. Daniel looked around the table. Yeah, what's their evidence? They're questioning your motives, the executive replied, saying this is reputation management. Silence. Daniel felt the old tension stir, the urge to defend, to prove. Ryan spoke carefully. We can issue a statement. Strong response. Elias shook his head slightly. That gives it oxygen. Daniel thought for a moment. At 17, when rumors spread about him lying, he had wanted to shout, to bring proof, to silence everyone. But he had waited. Now he felt the same crossroads. What do you want to do? Ryan asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. Nothing. The room shifted slightly. Nothing? The executive repeated. Daniel nodded once. Let the work speak. Ryan frowned slightly. They're attacking your credibility. Daniel met his gaze. They attacked it before. Elias smiled faintly. And time corrected it, Daniel replied. Silence followed. The executive looked uncertain. Public silence can look like guilt. Daniel's voice stayed calm. Only if there's something to hide. He stood slowly. We stay focused. Ryan watched him carefully. You're not angry? Daniel paused. I am, he admitted, but anger isn't strategy. Elias nodded approvingly. The meeting ended with quiet agreement. Outside, the city buzzed unaware. Daniel walked alone for a few minutes before heading home. He stopped under a streetlight, the same kind he used to stand beneath with Amara years ago. He remembered telling her once, What if I'm wrong about everything? She had replied, Then at least you'll be wrong with integrity. Now, he whispered to himself, we stay steady. His phone buzzed again. A message from Trevor. I got the interview invite. Thank you. Daniel smiled faintly. He typed back, Earn it. He slid the phone into his pocket. The competitor's noise still echoed faintly in his mind. But it didn't shake him, because doubt wasn't new. It was familiar territory. And Daniel Cole had learned how to stand in it without falling. He walked toward his car calmly. Not because the criticism didn't matter, but because it didn't define him. The same way laughter once didn't. The same way wealth now didn't. What defined him was the choice to respond with patience. And patience, he had learned, outlasted noise every time. Trevor showed up to the interview in a borrowed blazer. Daniel noticed immediately, not the blazer, the posture. Slightly tense, slightly guarded, hopeful but afraid to show it. Daniel Cole? Trevor asked carefully when he entered the room. Daniel stood and extended his hand. Daniel is fine. Trevor shook it, surprised by the firmness and calm. I didn't think you'd be here personally, Trevor admitted. Daniel smiled faintly. Why not? People at your level don't usually sit in these rooms. Daniel leaned back in his chair. I used to sit in rooms hoping someone would notice effort. Trevor swallowed. Elias and Ryan sat quietly to the side, observing. Daniel opened the file. You work nights? Yes, sir. Daniel? He corrected gently. Trevor nodded quickly. Yes, Daniel. And you're studying business management? Yes. Why? Trevor hesitated. Because I don't want to depend on luck. Daniel's eyes sharpened slightly. What do you want to depend on? My discipline. Silence. Ryan glanced at Elias. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Why should we invest in you? Trevor took a breath. Because I won't waste the opportunity. Daniel studied him carefully. That's not enough. Trevor blinked. Daniel continued calmly. Opportunity isn't about gratitude. It's about growth. Trevor nodded slowly. Then invest in me because I'll multiply it. That answer lingered. Daniel closed the file. You start Monday. Trevor's eyes widened. Really? Yes. But I thought... You thought there'd be more pressure? Daniel asked lightly. Trevor nodded. Daniel smiled faintly. Pressure comes later. After Trevor left, Ryan let out a low whistle. You saw yourself in him. Daniel didn't deny it. I saw hunger. Elias nodded. Good. Ryan leaned against the table. The competitor doubled down this morning. Daniel didn't react immediately. What now? They're questioning your leadership directly. Daniel exhaled slowly. What exactly are they saying? That you're inexperienced, that inheriting power isn't the same as earning it. Silence. Ryan watched him carefully. That one hits, Ryan admitted. Daniel nodded once. It should. Elias crossed his arms. It's not entirely false. Ryan looked at him sharply. Whose side are you on? Elias didn't flinch. Realities. Daniel appreciated that. He stood up slowly. Schedule a press conference. Ryan blinked. You said no response. I said no reaction, Daniel corrected calmly. This isn't reaction, it's clarity. That afternoon, cameras filled the conference hall. Reporters whispered. Daniel stepped to the podium without dramatic music or security theatrics, just steady posture. The first question came quickly. Mr. Cole, critics argue you inherited leadership without earning it. Your response? Daniel didn't rush. They're right. The room shifted. Ryan's eyebrows lifted slightly from the side. Daniel continued calmly. I inherited access, not credibility. Pens paused mid-air. So how do you earn credibility? Another reporter asked. By showing up, Daniel replied. Many say your foundation is image management. Daniel nodded once. They're allowed to question. Is it? Daniel met the reporter's gaze. It's an investment in discipline, not charity. Another question followed. Did you ever doubt your own readiness? Daniel paused briefly. Yes. The honesty quieted the room. And doubt forced me to prepare. He stepped away from the podium after only a few minutes. No dramatic statements, no defensive tone, just measured truth. Down back at headquarters, Ryan shook his head slowly. You disarmed them. Daniel removed his jacket calmly. No, he replied. I agreed where they weren't wrong. Elias smiled faintly. That's maturity. Daniel looked at both of them. Leadership isn't about pretending you earned everything alone. Ryan crossed his arms thoughtfully. You really don't care about ego. Daniel's expression softened slightly. I've already fought that battle. That night, Daniel sat alone in his office. The city skyline stretched beyond the glass. He remembered being 17 and staring at a cracked ceiling, wondering if patience was foolish. Now, patience felt strategic. His phone buzzed. A message from Trevor. First day prep started. I won't disappoint. Daniel typed back. Discipline first, results follow. Another message came in. From Ryan. My father called. Daniel looked at it carefully and replied, "And?" Ryan responded after a moment. "He saw the press conference. He said you handled it like a leader." Daniel leaned back in his chair. That must have been hard to hear. Ryan replied, "Yeah." Silence. Then another message. "I don't want to inherit arrogance again." Daniel stared at the screen. He typed slowly. "Then don't." The next few months moved quickly. Trevor excelled. Other students followed. The foundation grew steadily. Critics quieted. Not because Daniel silenced them, but because consistency did. One afternoon, Daniel visited a training session. Young men and women sat in rows, notebooks open. Trevor stood at the front presenting a proposal. Daniel watched quietly from the back. Trevor finished and looked up. When he noticed Daniel, he straightened. Daniel gave a small nod. Approval without applause. After the session, Trevor approached him. "I almost quit last week," Trevor admitted. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Why?" "It was overwhelming." Daniel nodded. "What kept you?" Trevor hesitated. "The thought that quitting would waste what you saw in me." Daniel looked at him carefully. "I didn't see potential," Daniel said calmly. Trevor frowned slightly. "Then what?" "Effort." Trevor nodded slowly. Daniel added, "Potential means nothing without discipline." Trevor swallowed and nodded again. Later that evening, Daniel stood once more on the balcony of Whitmore Grand Hotel, the same place where laughter once echoed against him. Now it echoed differently. Ryan joined him. "You ever miss being anonymous?" Ryan asked. Daniel thought for a moment. "Sometimes." Ryan nodded. "When it was simpler." Daniel glanced at him. "But simpler doesn't build strength." Ryan smiled faintly. "You really believe that?" "Yes." Ryan leaned on the railing. "You changed the trajectory of my life," Ryan said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "You changed it yourself." Ryan exhaled slowly. "Maybe. But you showed me what patience looks like." Daniel looked out at the city lights. "I showed you what survival looks like." Ryan nodded once. A few minutes later, Amara stepped onto the balcony. "You two planning world domination?" she teased lightly. Ryan laughed softly. "Not tonight." He excused himself, leaving them alone. Amara stepped beside Daniel. "You're quieter these days," she observed. "I'm more certain." She smiled. "About what?" "That identity isn't loud." She rested her hand in his. "You finally believe it." He nodded slowly. Yes." Below them, the city moved unaware of the journey that led here. 10 years of silence, 10 years of discipline, 10 years of waiting. Daniel looked at Amara. "You know what the real inheritance was?" She tilted her head. "What?" "The time." She smiled softly. "Time?" "Yes." "Explain." He took a slow breath. "If I had received everything at 18, I would have been reckless." She nodded gently. "But at 25, I was ready." She looked up at him. "You weren't just waiting for money," she said quietly. "You were waiting to become the man who could carry it." Daniel smiled. "Exactly." The wind moved softly around them. He didn't feel victorious. He felt aligned. He had been mocked. He had been doubted. He had been tested. And he had been loved. Not because of wealth, but because of who he chose to become without it. If you've watched this story unfold from the beginning, understand this. Wealth reveals. Time corrects. Discipline builds. And loyalty wins. If this journey resonated with you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were Daniel? Would you have proved them wrong immediately, or would you have waited? Because sometimes, the strongest move isn't reacting, it's becoming.